My father had been dead 48 hours when Mom slid a $14,000 funeral bill toward me and said, "Your brother gets the insurance. You pay for the funeral." I looked at Miles. He said nothing. The whole thing I asked. Mom didn't blink. "You make more." So I turned to the funeral director. "Before I pay anything, what did Dad already pay for?" He opened Richard Ellison's file, flipped through pages, then stopped. "The funeral your father selected is covered." Mom stared at the bill. "Then what's this?" The director turned the itemized sheet toward us. That was when I realized the $14,000 wasn't Dad's unfinished business. It was someone else's decision with my name attached to the payment. My name is Dana Ellison, and for most of my adult life, my family had one sentence for me: Dana will be fine. I was 44, divorced, and a senior procurement director for a medical device manufacturer in Richmond. I owned a townhouse, had a mortgage, retirement savings, and a 20-year-old daughter named Sophie who was still in college. I made good money. That part was true. What my family slowly turned it into was something else. Miles needed help because he had 3 children. Dana would be fine. Miles had a mortgage and a home equity loan. Dana would be fine. Miles had school expenses, sports fees, and a house full of people depending on him. Dana would be fine. Nobody said it maliciously. That almost made it worse. It became family shorthand for why my brother's problems deserved protection while mine were considered manageable. Dad was different. Richard Ellison had spent his career supervising utility operations, and he treated money the way he treated maintenance schedules deal with problems before they become emergencies. He hated debt. He labeled folders. He kept warranties nobody else remembered existed. And 4 years before he died, his older brother's funeral became exactly the kind of mess Dad hated. Relatives argued over the casket. Someone wanted more flowers. Someone else wanted a bigger reception. Then came the uncomfortable question of who was paying for everything, for weeks afterward. Dad complained about one sentence people kept using. He would have wanted this. Finally, he told me, "When my time comes, I'm not leaving you all a shopping project." I laughed at the time. I knew he had visited a funeral home afterward and made some arrangements. Mom knew too. Neither of us knew the details. Dad never treated it like a dramatic family announcement. That was his style. Solve the problem, file the paperwork, move on. Then, on a Sunday morning at 73, he suffered cardiac arrest at home. By Monday afternoon, Mom, Miles, and I were sitting inside the funeral home trying to decide what happened next, and before anyone had even finished explaining what Dad arranged, the old family rule had already returned. Miles needed protecting. Dana would be fine. Dad died on a Sunday morning. There was no long illness, no final conversation, no last-minute change to a will. He had a cardiac arrest at home by the time the ambulance reached the hospital. He was gone. Mom had spent 47 years married to him, and the shock changed her immediately. She moved through the first day in pieces. One minute she was answering relatives. The next, she was staring at Dad's empty chair. I handled hospital paperwork, called Sophie, and made sure Mom ate something. Miles came over with his wife and stayed late for 24 hours. Nobody argued about money. Then Monday afternoon came. The 4 of us met with the funeral director at Hawthorne and Bell. His name was Thomas Green, and he had Dad's file already waiting on the table. Before he opened it, Mom started talking about what she wanted: a larger casket, more flowers, a second evening visitation because Dad had worked with so many people, a catered reception afterward, a limousine for the immediate family. Thomas took notes without reacting. Then Mom turned toward us. "There's also your father's life insurance." That was the first I had heard of it. "How much?" "About 100,000. Miles looked uncomfortable. Mom continued. "Your father named Miles as the beneficiary." I looked at my brother. He said, "Dad set it up that way years ago." There was a pause where I could feel everyone waiting for me to object. I didn't. "If Dad named you, then it's yours." Miles blinked. Mom seemed almost relieved. "He has 3 children." "Dana." "I know. I did not ask why Dad chose him. I did not ask for half. Whatever reasons Dad had, he had made that decision while he was alive. The director returned to the arrangements as Mom added options. The numbers climbed. By the time Thomas finished the first estimate, the additional balance was just under $14,000. I stared at the total. $14,000 would not bankrupt me. That was not the point. The familiar assumption had arrived before anyone had asked what I wanted. I assumed Dad's earlier planning must have covered less than I thought. Then, Mom slid the paper toward me. "Your brother gets the insurance. You pay for the funeral." I looked at her, then at Miles. He did not say a word, and that silence told me this was not a request they had just come up with. It was a plan they expected me to accept. The whole thing I asked. Mom looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. "Miles has 3 children. Sophie is grown. You make more." That wasn't my question. She pushed the estimate closer. "Just put it on your card. You can afford to pay it off." I stared at the $14,000 balance. Then I looked at Miles. He shifted in his chair. "Dad named me beneficiary for a reason. I'm not asking for your insurance." "Then what's the issue?" I turned the paper back toward Mom. "The issue is that you decided his money is protected and mine is available." Mom exhaled sharply. "This is your father's funeral." "Dana." "I know. That was exactly why I wanted to understand what I was being asked to pay for." I turned to Thomas. "Before I pay anything, what did Dad already pay for?" For the first time since we sat down, Mom stopped talking. Thomas pulled Richard Ellison's file toward him. It was thicker than I expected. He opened the folder and went through a signed pre-need contract, a funding confirmation, cemetery paperwork, and a worksheet with Dad's selections. He checked one page, then another. "Finally!" He looked up. "The funeral Richard selected is covered." Mom frowned. "What do you mean, covered?" "His guaranteed funeral home services were fully funded. The burial arrangements he made were funded as well." I looked at the estimate again. The total had not changed. $14,000. Mom noticed it too. Her eyes moved from the file to the statement. "Then what's this?" Thomas turned the itemized sheet around so all of us could see it. "These are the changes and additions requested today." Nobody spoke. He pointed to the first line. Upgraded casket, then the next, second visitation, another, family limousine, then flowers, expanded memorial printing, and the catered reception. Mom's face tightened. Richard chose the basic package. Thomas stayed neutral. I would describe it as a standard traditional service. That landed differently. Dad had not left us with an unpaid funeral. He had chosen one, paid for it, and documented it. Mom had walked in, replaced parts of his plan with a more expensive version, then slid the difference across the table to me. I felt my anger settle into something colder. Before I could say anything, Thomas reached back into Dad's file. "There's one more thing you may want to see." He pulled out a preferences worksheet covered in Dad's handwriting, and suddenly the $14,000 was no longer the most important thing on the table. Thomas placed Dad's preferences worksheet between us. I recognized his handwriting immediately. He had initialed one visitation. No limousine, standard casket, simple memorial materials. Then, at the bottom, he had written one sentence by hand. "Keep it simple. I don't want the kids spending money they don't need to spend." Nobody spoke for several seconds. It was such a Dad sentence that for one awful moment I could hear his voice saying it. No speeches, no guilt. Just solve the problem before it became one. Mom finally shook her head. Richard always said things like that. He didn't understand what a funeral costs now. Thomas answered carefully. He understood the package he selected, and the guaranteed portions are funded. Mom looked at me. "Your father deserves better than the standard version. Dad chose the standard version. That doesn't mean we have to." "No." "It doesn't." She seemed relieved until I continued. "If you want something different, that's your choice. But those are your changes. Not Dad's unpaid funeral." Her face hardened. "I cannot believe we're discussing money while your father is lying here. You brought up money when you decided who got it and who paid it." Miles shifted in his chair. "The insurance isn't funeral money." I turned to him. "I agree. That caught him off guard. Then I said, "And my savings aren't funeral money either." He looked down. I pushed the estimate back toward the center of the table. "I'm not asking you for Dad's policy. I'm not asking Mom to cancel anything she wants. I'm saying I'm not putting $14,000 of someone else's choices on my credit card." Mom stared at the list. "So what are you willing to pay for?" That was the first time anyone had asked. Not what I could afford, not what Miles needed, not what Mom assumed. What I was actually willing to choose and pay for myself. For my father. The photo display matters to me. So does a fuller obituary. I'll cover those. Thomas estimated both at under $900. Mom looked disappointed. "That's it. That's what I'm choosing." She turned to Miles. He immediately looked back at the itemized sheet. For the first time, the upgrades were no longer abstract. They had prices beside them. The limousine suddenly cost $750. The second visitation was over $1,000. The larger casket upgrade added more than $5,000. Miles tapped the page. Did Dad actually pick the other casket himself? Thomas nodded. Yes. Miles sat back. Then he pointed to the limousine. "Did Dad want this? No," I said. He hated limousines. Mom looked from him to me. The entire meeting had changed. 10 minutes earlier, every upgrade had sounded like something Dad deserved. Now that nobody could automatically charge it to me, each one had to survive a different question. Was it important enough for the person asking for it to pay for it? Miles looked at the total again. Then he said quietly, "Maybe we should go through this one line at a time." That was when the $14,000 funeral started shrinking. We went through the list one line at a time. The limousine disappeared first. Miles looked at the price, then at Mom. Dad hated being driven anywhere. Mom gave him a tired look, but she did not argue. The second visitation went next. Thomas explained that one visitation plus the funeral service would still give Dad's former coworkers and friends plenty of time to come through. The larger casket was harder. Mom kept saying, "He deserves something nicer." So Thomas placed Dad's original selection beside the upgrade. It was not cheap looking. It was a solid mid-range metal casket Dad had chosen himself. Miles asked, "If this is the one he picked, why are we changing it?" Mom did not have a good answer. The floral package came down too. We kept family arrangements and removed the oversized displays. The catered reception changed from a large event to a smaller meal after the burial. Miles offered to cover that himself. "I can do dinner," he said. I paid for the expanded obituary and the photo display I had chosen. Nothing about the final plan felt stripped down. It felt like Dad. One visitation. A traditional service. People from his old utility department filled 2 rows. Neighbors came. Family photographs covered the display tables. Sophie helped arrange pictures of Dad holding fish, fixing a lawnmower, and sleeping in a chair with a grandchild on his chest. Nobody stood there calculating what the casket cost. Nobody asked whether the flowers had been upgraded. They talked about Richard Ellison after the graveside service. Mom stood beside me for a moment. She looked exhausted. "Your father would have liked this." I could have reminded her that he had planned most of it himself. I didn't. I just said yes. Later, while we were eating, Miles came over. "I should have said something at the funeral home." "Yes." He winced slightly. "I figured if Dad named me on the policy, he wanted me to keep it. I think he probably did." That surprised him. "I never asked for the insurance." "Miles." "I know. I just didn't expect everyone to protect your money by volunteering mine." He looked down at his plate. "That wasn't fair." "No." It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was enough. A week later, Miles filed the life insurance claim with the insurer. I did not call the company. I did not challenge the beneficiary. I did not ask anyone how to stop it. Dad had made that decision. I respected it. And when Miles eventually received the money, nobody could honestly say the funeral argument had been about jealousy. It had been about something much older in our family. Whenever Miles needed protection, the answer was help. Whenever I was expected to absorb something, the answer was always the same. Dana will be fine. After Dad's funeral, I was finally done letting that sentence decide what belonged to me. Several weeks after the funeral, Miles received the insurance money. He did exactly what I expected him to do with it. He paid down the home equity loan, cleared the highest interest credit card, put some money into savings, and set aside part for the kids. No sports car, no vacation. Nothing that made Dad's decision look foolish. And that mattered, because people kept assuming I must be angry about the policy. One cousin finally asked me, "Doesn't it bother you that Miles got all of it?" I said. "Dad was allowed to choose his beneficiary. Mom wasn't allowed to choose my credit card. That was the difference. The insurance had never been the argument." A month after the funeral, Mom asked me to come over. She looked smaller without Dad in the house, for the first time. She admitted what had been happening in her head. "When your father died, I looked at our savings and thought, this has to last me the rest of my life. I understand that. I was scared to start spending it. I understand that too." She looked down. "I knew you could handle the funeral. You could have asked me for help." "I know. You didn't ask. You told me what I was paying." Mom was quiet. Then she said, "I wasn't thinking clearly. You were grieving. But you still assumed I would say yes." That was harder for her to hear, because the funeral had not created that assumption. It had exposed it. For years. Miles needed help. I could handle myself. Miles's money had reasons attached to it. Mine had availability attached to it. A few days later, Mom called again. I should have asked instead of assigned. That would have been different. Miles apologized too. Not for accepting Dad's insurance. For sitting there while Mom volunteered my money. I accepted that apology because it was the right one. I kept thinking about Dad's handwritten note. Keep it simple. He had understood something all of us missed. Grief can make spending feel like proof of love. Dad had taken that pressure off us before he died. The insurance was his gift to Miles. But the prepaid funeral was something else. It was Dad making sure none of us had to prove we loved him with a receipt. For me, that became part of his planning. I was most grateful he had left behind. A year later, Mom still worried about money sometimes. Miles still had 3 kids. I still earned more. None of that changed. What changed was the assumption. Now, when Mom needed help, she asked. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no. And nobody treated either answer like a betrayal. I kept a photocopy of Dad's funeral worksheet in a folder at home. Not because it had legal power. Because every time I saw his handwriting, I remembered exactly what he had tried to do for us. Keep it simple. Don't spend money you don't need to spend. Dad's last financial gift was not the life insurance. It was making sure none of us had to prove we loved him with a receipt. Miles got the policy Dad chose for him. Mom kept the savings she needed for her future. And I kept something I should have protected years earlier, the right to decide what my own money was for. If you were sitting at that funeral home table, would you have paid the $14,000 to keep the peace or asked to see Dad's file too? Comment below and subscribe for more family betrayal and clean revenge stories.